Okay, guys, today we're going to go back to Europe and we're going to check out what's going on there once we left it. Now, the last time we left Europe, we went ahead and figured out that the Germans basically had taken over all the territory in Europe. We had gone over a major event there within our quiz preparation on the Battle of Britain, and we learned all about that and so on. And then we jumped to the Pacific after the battle, after the Pearl Harbor was attacked and so on. Well, now that we've fought our way through the Pacific, we're going to go back to Europe, and we're going to stay here for about a week and a half. The war in Europe finishes before the battle in the Pacific. Okay, so we're going to have to go back to the Pacific at some point to finish up the entire war. But the last time we left Europe, there was only two real countries that we need to talk about that has dealings in Europe, and it's going to be a lesson on the Soviet Union and the United States. So today is all about the Soviet Union. We're going to look at the famous battles there, and we're going to look and see how the Nazi-Soviet pact, as expected, is probably not going to last very long. Now, so the fate of the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1944 will be talked about in this lesson today. Now, when we last left the Soviets, we had mentioned them in the Doolittle raid, but we last left them when we talked about the Nazi-Soviet pact that, remember, was signed in August of 1939. It was a non-aggression treaty, meaning that if war were to break out, the Germans and the Soviets would not go to war. Also remember that it split Poland in half and divided it up. Now, when we last left Europe, remember that the Germans had finally taken over France, which basically takes over the entire continent pretty much there on June 22nd, 1940. Now, we all understand that once France fell and that the British were under control by the Battle of Britain, now Hitler could focus back east, and inevitably the Nazi-Soviet pact is going to come to an end. And that official date is June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans go ahead and invade the Soviet Union. Now notice that it was 1 year exactly after France fell. Maybe that year is coincidence, maybe it's not. Now, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was called Operation Barbarossa. Now, Hitler personally named it that after the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy named Frederick Barbarossa. Now, his goal, Barbarossa's, was to make Germany a dominant power and unify it in Europe, bring and strengthen Germany. We do know about Frederick Barbarossa because when we were talking about the Crusades, remember, he was the gentleman that fell off his horse, broke his neck, and died in a river on the way to the Crusades. So maybe Hitler should have rethought naming this operation after Frederick Barbarossa. One way or not, the Eastern Front of World War II is now open, and it was about an 18 to 2,000 mile long battlefront that the Germans were going to be responsible for. Now, one goal of Hitler, and the reason why he eventually wanted to enter the Soviet Union, was he wanted to fill the western part of Soviet Union with German speakers. He wanted to fill the western part with Germans, and he also needed the oil fields, the oil-rich fields in the Caucasus Mountains and so on, okay? So those were his goals, and that's what he was driven by. Now, the Soviets during this were actually aided by the Americans, and there was no way that we could go through the German Empire there in Europe to get supplies because of the blockades, because of the German U-boats all over the North Sea, the Baltic Sea by this time, and the Atlantic Ocean. So we actually trucked them. Now, down at the bottom right-hand corner of your map, just imagine convoys of American trucks literally trucking through Jordan and Syria and Iraq up there through the Caucasus Mountains to try to give the Soviets some aid. All right, so they were aided by the Americans through the Persian Gulf. Remember, we are in the war by now. And one thing that we're going to revisit is the concept of the scorched earth policy. Now, if you recall, the Soviet Union, or Russia back then, was invaded before, and it was invaded by Napoleon. Now, remember, Napoleon and his men could not figure out why the Russians were burning everything when they were in retreat. And remember, we talked about this. We talked about how the Russians were not going to be able to live off the land. They weren't going to be able to live off the farm. They weren't going to have any livestock and things. So it was going to be tougher on Napoleon once he came into Russia. Well, they did the same thing to Hitler. And the Germans talked about how the Soviets by this time were burning everything in their wake, farms and so on. And they re-practiced the scorched earth policy. Now, The first place that Hitler and the Germans are going to land is at the town of Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. Okay, named after Lenin and so on. So you can see there from September of 1941 to January of 1944, this event is going to happen. Now, this was not a battle. Notice that I call it a siege. A siege is when a town or a place is surrounded. It is under siege, all right? No one can get in and no one can get out. And to take it a step further, no supplies can get in and no supplies can get out, all right? So this was a siege. And by the way, it is the longest siege on a city in modern times, okay? It was the event that hosted the longest siege on any city during modern times. Well, let's go ahead and answer the questions of why Leningrad was targeted, okay? So you can see Leningrad on the map up there. It is star number 2, right there on the Baltic Sea. Now, Leningrad used to be the former capital, all right, before the revolution, all right? The Russian Revolution started here, okay? So Hitler wanted to target that. But from a strategic standpoint, Leningrad was also home to the Soviet Baltic Fleet. All of their ships were located for the Baltic area of the world to the north in Leningrad. So, from a military standpoint, the Germans and Hitler would definitely target Leningrad. Now, the number of German dead here are unknown, and that's a central theme that we're going to talk about as we move along and as we see how the Germans aren't going to tell the world how many men had died. They're not going to tell the world accurately how many Germans died, okay? Now, here, the Soviets are going to have 5 million casualties, many of them civilians, okay? So the civilian toll is going to take a toll on the Soviets. Now, we're going to learn in a couple minutes about a video. We're going to learn about all the fun facts, so I don't want to ruin it. So there's a bunch of stuff that happened here, how people were starving. The winter was horrible. We're going to learn about how the people of Leningrad had to find meals and be creative with eating. As far as those 5 million casualties there, 1 million were soldiers, 2.5 million were sick and wounded, and another 1.5 million were civilians. So this is going to be a very, very sad moment in Russian-Soviet history, and it happens here during World War II, during this event called the Siege of Leningrad. Now, by looking at these images, you can tell, look at the size of the German gun there, you can tell that literally buildings were blown to pieces, all right, as the city was under siege. The dead would pile up. They could not dig graves fast enough for these people to have a proper burial. Many of those people that you see in the image down below to the right, died of starvation, died of cold. The electricity was cut. It was very cold during those winters and so on. And you can see that it was not a very fun moment in history, all right, for the Russian and Soviet people. At this point, I'd like for you to stop. I didn't give you all the facts about this because you're going to learn about some really fun, not fun facts, but facts about the Siege of Leningrad, and we're going to bring it to life. So stop right at this point, stop your notes, go to the video of Leningrad, answer the questions, and then come back to this note session. So you guys have just seen the siege at Leningrad, and hopefully you got a lot of those facts and you understand totally what happened there by listening to me and then watching that video. Now, from Leningrad, the Germans are going to they're going to invade Moscow, and they're going to get to Moscow by October of 1941, while the siege of Leningrad is still going on. Now, compared to Leningrad, they're not going to be at Moscow very long. Well, one of the reasons why Moscow was targeted by the Germans is because it's the capital. So from an egotistical standpoint that Hitler probably had, he is going to hit the Soviets in Moscow, their capital. It was also a military objective, okay? That is where a lot of the arsenal for the Soviet army was. You can see tanks and so on. Now, one thing that happened in the Battle of Moscow is that the Germans could barely penetrate the town. It's because the people of Moscow really came together and defended their town. You can see there in that one image that the people are digging ditches and so on. In a video that you're going to watch, you're going to see a lot of stuff that the civilians did to save their town and so on. At the end of this little battle, the Germans are going to have 400,000 casualties. Now look at those numbers, 400,000 casualties just in one battle for the Germans. And then obviously the Soviet number is going to be large once again. So 1 million casualties of that is going to hit and affect the Soviet army. Now, most of those, as I say there, are going to be captured. Okay, so most of those Soviet soldiers will be captured during this Battle of Moscow. Now, I also would like for you to stop again. I want you to go watch the video on the Battle of Moscow, so stop your notes and come back to me when you're done answering the questions for Moscow. Okay, so at this point, you should have a really good idea about the Siege of Leningrad, and after watching that video, you should have a really good idea about the Battle of Moscow and a couple of facts about the Battle of Moscow and the Seven Sisters being built and so on. Now, by this time, Hitler is going to target Stalingrad, and in July of 1942, you can see that they're going to fight, a 6 to 7 month battle there through the winter and into the winter of 1943 in February of 1943. Now, Stalingrad is one of the most bloodiest battles in the history of warfare, not just in World War II, but in the history of warfare. The Battle of Stalingrad, now put a huge star on this, is the turning point of World War II, okay? It's the turning point of World War II in Europe because it was the first time that the Germans were defeated. Now, the Germans are going to move right in through the city of Stalingrad, as you're going to see in a film in a couple minutes. At one point during this battle, 90% of Stalingrad was controlled by the Germans. 90% of the city was controlled by the Germans. So you would wonder, how in the heck could this city fall? How could it ever win a decisive battle when the Germans were in control of about 90% of the city? When the battle first started, the German broke right through the Soviet lines. There was literally fighting from door to door. It was said that when grenades were thrown in windows, the fighting was so close that the Soviets could throw the grenades right back out the window before they blew up and so on. So it was some of the scariest fighting of the war that you're going to learn about here in a second. Now, Stalingrad was obviously taken by the Germans and pretty much defeated until after Christmas of 1943. The Soviets diverted troops away from Moscow down to Stalingrad. Now, as you're going to see in the video, you're going to see that certain parts of Stalingrad were not surrounded and taken care of by German troops. They were taken care of by members of the Axis powers. Now, in the southwest corner of Stalingrad were the Italians and the Hungarians. And one thing that happened, and one of the main reasons why the Battle of Stalingrad will be won by the Soviets, because the Soviets actually attacked that side of the city and blew right through the Italian lines and went into the city and actually saved the city. Now, at the end of the day, or at the end of the battle, the Axis powers, the Germans are going to have 850,000 casualties. 850,000 casualties at the hands of predominantly the Germans and some of the other Axis powers. And the Soviets are going to have, there's another huge number, 1.1 million casualties after the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, one of my favorite stats, and I want you to pay attention to this very closely on this one stat at the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. When the battle was over and the city was saved, there were 91,000 German soldiers that became prisoners, or POWs, prisoners of war. So at the end of this battle, the Soviets took 91,000 German soldiers prisoner. Now, it was the winter of 1943, so after a couple weeks, 27,000 of those German troops died in the first couple of weeks. Now, pay attention to this stat. Do your math. If you take 91,000 and you subtract 27,000, you are left with 64,000 Germans, okay? Now, listen to this. After a couple weeks, there were still 64,000 German prisoners of war. Of the 64,000, only 6,000 returned to Germany 10 years after the war in 1955, which means there are about 58,000 German soldiers that were prisoners of war that were unaccounted for. Now, in the class, I'd ask you, where do you think they went? The possible answer would be they're at the bottom of the Volga River. So the people of Stalingrad and the Soviet army probably ridded themselves of the other 64,000 troops, German troops, that are unaccounted for. Now, the images of Stalingrad are amazing. I mean, you can see how the city down in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see how city blocks and buildings were just reduced to rubble. You can see German troops there. You can see the Soviet troops there, literally fighting from building to building. In some cases, it was so bad at Stalingrad, people of Stalingrad didn't have food, and they were melting down wallpaper glue and eating it. They were trying to melt down leather, and they were eating that, and they called it jelly meat, for example. And there's all kinds of fun facts. Now, there is a movie that portrays the Battle of Stalingrad. There is a movie Stalingrad that came out, but there's an older one called Enemy at the Gates, which is a movie that you might want to add to your collection. It is pretty historically accurate. It's actually the story about a famous Soviet sniper that you actually learned about in your bell ringer called Vasily Zaitsev. And it talks about how and it gives you all kinds of fun facts about the Battle of Stalingrad itself, and how he became a national hero and boosted the people of Stalingrad's morale through propaganda. He had all these confirmed kills. This young sniper, this peasant boy that grew up shooting rabbits with his grandfather. We're going to read the story about him, and we'll learn a lot more about him. But it's a pretty cool story that you get to see him facing off with a German sniper that isn't exactly historically accurate, but it is a pretty fun story to listen to, and you get to learn a lot about the Battle of Stalingrad there. So at this point, to wrap up the lesson on the Soviet Union, go ahead and watch that last video, answer those questions, and you guys can go ahead and continue with your Battle of the Pacific presentations, and that's how we'll end class today.